February 1959, Soviet search teams discovered something that would haunt investigators for over 6 decades. 9 experienced hikers lay dead in the remote Ural Mountains of Siberia, their bodies scattered across nearly a mile of frozen wilderness. What they found at the campsite defied all logic. A tent sliced open from the inside, footprints leading barefoot into sub-zero temperatures, and injuries so severe and inexplicable that even seasoned investigators struggled to document them. The case file, classified for 30 years by Soviet authorities, reveals a mystery so disturbing that when declassified documents finally emerged, they raised more questions than answers. Hidden in military, archives and forensic reports, this is the story of 9 young adventurers who ventured into the wilderness and encountered something that drove them from their shelter into certain death in the Siberian night. Before we dive into this chilling case, make sure you're subscribed to Fear Classified. We uncover these forgotten mysteries every week, and this channel definitely isn't for everyone. Only for those brave enough to learn what really happened when experienced mountaineers abandoned their only shelter and walked to their deaths in the frozen darkness of the Ural Mountains. What you're about to hear challenges everything we think we know about human survival instincts. This is the Dyatlov Pass incident, and after 65 years we still don't have answers. The year 1959 found the Soviet Union in the midst of an intense period of technological advancement and Cold War tensions. The space race was accelerating, nuclear testing was frequent, and military installations dotted the remote landscapes of Siberia. Against this backdrop of secrecy and scientific progress, outdoor recreation was experiencing a renaissance among Soviet youth, particularly among university students eager to explore their vast homeland. At the Ural Polytechnical Institute in Sverdlovsk, now known as Yekaterinburg, hiking and skiing expeditions had become increasingly popular among the student body. The university actively encouraged these adventures, viewing them as character-building exercises that promoted Soviet ideals of strength, self-reliance, and love of the motherland. The northern Urals represented one of the most challenging destinations for these young adventurers. The mountain range, stretching over 1,100 miles from the Arctic Ocean to Kazakhstan, formed a natural barrier between European Russia and Siberia. In winter, temperatures routinely dropped to -30 degrees Celsius, with winds that could kill an exposed person within hours. Into this harsh landscape came Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student with extensive mountaineering experience. Dyatlov had been planning an ambitious winter expedition to Otorten Mountain, a remote peak in the northern Urals whose name meant "don't go there" in the local Mansi language. The expedition would cover nearly 200 miles of wilderness terrain and was intended to qualify the participants for Grade 3 certification, the highest level of mountaineering competency in the Soviet system. Soviet records show that Dyatlov assembled a group of 9 companions, all experienced hikers and skiers from the Ural Polytechnical Institute and other regional universities. The team included Yudit Zinaida Kolmogorova, a 22-year-old economics student and accomplished athlete; Rustam Slobodin, a 23-year-old engineering student known for his technical expertise; Lyudmila Dubinina, a 20-year-old economics student and passionate outdoors enthusiast; Alexander Kolovatov, a 24-year-old physics student; Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, both 21-year-old engineering students; Nikolai Thibaut Brignoles, a 24-year-old construction engineering student; Semyon Zolotaryov, a 37-year-old World War II veteran and group instructor; and Alexander Zolotaryov, whose participation was added at the last minute. University documents indicate that the expedition received official approval on January 8, 1959. The planned route would take them by train to Ivdel, then by truck to Vizhai, the last inhabited settlement, before they would ski approximately 50 miles through wilderness to reach Otorten Mountain. The entire journey was scheduled to last 3 weeks, with their expected return date set for February 12, 1959. What made this expedition particularly noteworthy was its ambitious nature and the experience level of its participants. Soviet mountaineering standards were exceptionally rigorous, and achieving Grade 3 certification required demonstrated competency in extreme conditions. These were not amateur adventurers, they were seasoned outdoors enthusiasts who had successfully completed numerous challenging expeditions in harsh environments. The political climate of 1959 also adds context to what would later unfold. The Soviet Union maintained strict control over information, particularly regarding incidents that occurred in remote regions near sensitive military installations. The northern Urals housed several restricted facilities, and the movement of citizens in these areas was carefully monitored. When something went wrong in the wilderness, the response would inevitably involve multiple layers of government oversight and potential classification of evidence. Official expedition records show that the group departed Sverdlovsk on January 23, 1959, taking the overnight train to Ivdel. From there, they traveled by truck to Vizhai, where they spent the night of January 25th as guests of local residents. According to witness testimony documented years later, the group was in high spirits, well-equipped, and confident about their planned route. On January 26th, the team began their trek into the wilderness, pulling sleds loaded with food, camping equipment, and cold weather gear. Their plan called for establishing several camps along the route, with careful attention to weather conditions and escape routes. They carried a portable radio but expected limited communication opportunities due to the remote terrain and atmospheric conditions common in the region. Weather records from January 1959 indicate that the Ural Mountains were experiencing typical winter conditions for the season: extremely cold temperatures, frequent snowfall, and strong winds. These were the conditions the experienced team had planned for and equipped themselves to handle. The last confirmed sighting of the Dyatlov group alive came from Mansi hunters who encountered them on January 28th. According to these witnesses, documented in later investigation files, the team appeared well prepared and confident, with no apparent problems or concerns. The hunters noted that the group was making good progress toward their destination and showed no signs of distress or equipment failure. What happened over the next several days would create one of the most enduring mysteries in mountaineering history, a mystery that would consume Soviet investigators, baffle international experts, and spawn countless theories ranging from plausible to bizarre. The stage was set for an encounter that would challenge everything experts thought they knew about human behavior in survival situations. On February 1st, 1959, according to reconstruction based on the group's own photographs and diary entries found at the scene, the Dyatlov expedition established what would become their final camp on the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl, a mountain whose Mansi name translates to Mountain of the Dead. Investigation records indicate that the team had deviated from their planned route, choosing to camp on the exposed mountainside rather than in the shelter of the forest below. This decision puzzled investigators, as experienced mountaineers would typically seek the protection of trees in severe weather conditions. The group's own photographs, recovered from cameras found at the scene, show them setting up camp in increasingly harsh conditions, with strong winds and blowing snow clearly visible. The final photograph on Igor Dyatlov's camera, developed months later by Soviet investigators, shows team members working to secure their tent against fierce winds. The timestamp and lighting conditions suggest this image was taken in late afternoon as the group prepared for what they expected to be another routine night in the wilderness. Diary entries recovered from the campsite written in Dyatlov's hand indicate that the group was aware of deteriorating weather but remained confident in their preparations. The last entry, dated February 1st, describes the team's decision to cache some supplies and travel light to the summit of Otorten before returning. According to these notes, morale remained high despite challenging conditions. What happened next must be reconstructed from physical evidence, as no member of the group survived to provide testimony. The sequence of events that investigators later pieced together from the scene defies conventional understanding of human behavior in survival situations. Sometime during the night of February 1 to 2, 1959, something KE used 9 experienced mountaineers to cut their way out of their tent from the inside and flee into the sub-zero Siberian night, wearing only their underwear and socks. The tent, investigators later determined, had been sliced open with a knife in multiple places, creating openings large enough for people to escape quickly. The cuts were made from inside the tent, ruling out external attack by animals or humans. The scene that greeted investigators weeks later defied explanation. The tent remained partially standing, weighed down by snow, but still containing most of the group's belongings. Sleeping bags were arranged as if the occupants had been resting normally. Food, clothing, and equipment remained undisturbed inside the shelter. Most puzzling of all, the group's shoes were still arranged neatly inside the tent, suggesting that whatever drove them outside happened so suddenly that they didn't have time to dress for the brutal cold. Footprint analysis conducted by Soviet investigators revealed a chilling detail that would haunt the case for decades. In the snow outside the tent, investigators found the tracks of 9 people walking barefoot or in socks toward the forest below. The footprints showed no signs of struggle or coercion. The tracks indicated a calm, organized departure from the campsite. Some prints showed evidence of socks or makeshift foot coverings, but none indicated proper winter footwear. Even more disturbing was the organization of the tracks. According to forensic analysis detailed in the case file, the footprints didn't scatter randomly as might be expected from a panicked flight. Instead, they showed the group moving together in a relatively organized manner down the slope toward a stand of cedar trees approximately 1 mile from their tent. This suggested that whatever drove them from their shelter, they responded as a cohesive group rather than individuals in panic. The weather conditions on the night of February 2 make their departure even more inexplicable. Meteorological records show temperatures dropping to -25 to -30 degrees Celsius, with strong winds creating a deadly wind chill factor. Under these conditions, inadequately clothed humans would begin experiencing hypothermia within minutes and would lose the ability to function normally within a half hour. Soviet investigators meticulously documented the scene, taking photographs and measurements that would later become crucial evidence in understanding the group's final hours. The tent's condition suggested no external violence. It had not been damaged by animals, weather, or human attackers other than the deliberate cuts made from inside. Personal belongings remained untouched, ruling out robbery or theft as motives. Most puzzling of all was the absence of the group members themselves. Despite the clear trail leading away from the tent, the immediate area revealed no bodies, no signs of further struggle, and no indication of what had become of 9 people who had walked away from their only shelter into certain death. The investigation would later reveal that the group's ordeal was far from over after they left the tent. But first, investigators had to understand what could possibly cause experienced mountaineers to make a decision that guaranteed their days. As in the brutal Siberian wilderness, analysis of the tent's interior provided few clues. Personal diaries contained no mention of unusual occurrences or concerns. Equipment inventories showed the group was well supplied with food, fuel, and cold weather gear, none of which they took with them in their flight from the tent. The last photographs on their cameras showed normal expedition activities with no signs of distress or unusual phenomena. The mystery deepened when investigators realized that the group had been missing for nearly a month before anyone became concerned about their whereabouts. The delayed alarm meant that whatever evidence existed at the scene had been subject to weeks of severe weather, making forensic analysis exponentially more difficult. What drove 9 experienced survivors to abandon their shelter and walk to their deaths in the Siberian night remained a question that would consume investigators for decades. The physical evidence was clear. They had left voluntarily in an organized manner, with no external coercion. But the reason for this fatal decision remained as mysterious as the frozen wilderness that claimed their lives. The alarm was first raised on February 12, 1959, when the Dyatlov group failed to return to Sverdlovsk as scheduled. University officials initially attributed the delay to weather conditions or route changes. Experienced mountaineers often extended expeditions when conditions warranted additional caution. However, as days passed without communication, concern grew among family members and university administrators. Soviet records show that on February 16th, worried relatives of the missing hikers contacted university authorities demanding action. The families pointed out that Igor Dyatlov was meticulous about maintaining schedules and would never leave loved ones worried without cause. Under pressure from the families and recognizing their legal obligations, university officials contacted local authorities to request assistance. The initial response revealed the bureaucratic complexities of Soviet administration. Local police in Sverdlovsk lacked expertise in wilderness search and rescue operations. Regional authorities debated jurisdiction as the expedition's planned route crossed multiple administrative boundaries. Military units stationed in the northern Urals operated under different command structures and required special authorization to participate in civilian operations. On February 17, 1959, a preliminary search operation was authorized under the direction of local police chief Vladimir Korotayev. The initial team consisted of university volunteers, local police officers, and several experienced mountaineers familiar with the northern Ural region. However, harsh weather conditions and the vast expanse of potential search territory made immediate deployment impossible. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mansi hunters working in the region reported encountering abandoned equipment along known hiking routes. These indigenous people, intimately familiar with the harsh landscape, offered their tracking expertise to the search effort. Their knowledge of local terrain and weather patterns would prove crucial in narrowing the search area. On February 20th, the first organized search team departed Ivdel for the wilderness. The group included university students who had previously hiked with members of the Dyatlov expedition, local police, officers, and Mansi guides. They followed the same route the missing hikers had taken, hoping to find evidence of their passage or signs of where they might have established emergency shelters. The search team's daily reports, preserved in Soviet archives, reveal the enormous challenges they faced. Deep snow obscured landmarks and potential evidence. Extreme cold limited the time searchers could spend exposed without risking their own safety. Radio communication was sporadic at best, hampering coordination efforts. Most frustrating of all, the vast wilderness offered countless locations where a tent or shelter might be hidden from view. After 4 days of searching without results, authorities expanded the operation. Additional search teams were organized, including experienced mountaineers from Sverdlovsk, military personnel with cold weather training, and local volunteers. Aircraft were requested to provide aerial reconnaissance, though poor weather conditions limited their effectiveness. The mood among searchers grew increasingly grim as days passed without finding any trace of the missing group. Experienced mountaineers on the search teams knew that survival in the northern Urals for extended periods required proper shelter and adequate supplies. If the Dyatlov group had encountered serious problems, time was rapidly running out for any chance of finding them alive. On February 23rd, searcher Mikhail Sharavin, a student at the Ural Polytechnical Institute and experienced mountaineer, made the discovery that would transform the missing persons case into one of the most baffling mysteries in Soviet history. Following ski tracks along the eastern slope of Kholat Shakal, Sharavin spotted what appeared to be fabric protruding from the snow. Investigation records document Sharavin's account of his discovery. According to his testimony, he initially thought he had found an abandoned supply cache or temporary shelter. As he approached, however, he realized he was looking at a tent that had been partially collapsed and covered by weeks of accumulated snow. The scene immediately struck him as wrong. The tent was pitched in an exposed location where no experienced mountaineer would choose to camp. Sharavin's shouts brought other members of the search team to the location. What they found defied their understanding of wilderness survival. The tent was sliced open in multiple places, with the cuts clearly made from inside the structure. Personal belongings were scattered inside but showed no signs of violence or theft. Most disturbing of all, the tent's occupants were nowhere to be found. The search team immediately recognized they were no longer conducting a rescue operation, but a recovery mission. The condition of the tent and the absence of the group members indicated that whatever had happened had occurred weeks earlier. Following established protocols, they secured the scene and radioed for additional investigators and forensic specialists. What the search team found in the snow around the tent would haunt them for years to come. Clear footprints led away from the shelter toward the forest below. Footprints made by people wearing little or no footwear in deadly cold conditions. The tracks showed no signs of coercion or struggle, suggesting the tent's occupants had left voluntarily. But this revelation only deepened the mystery, as no rational explanation existed for why experienced mountaineers would abandon their shelter in deadly conditions. As word of the discovery spread, the nature of the search operation changed dramatically. What had begun as a missing persons case was now a death investigation requiring forensic expertise, detailed documentation, and careful analysis of physical evidence. Soviet authorities faced a mystery that challenged everything they thought they knew about human behavior in survival situations. The search for the missing hikers' bodies was about to begin, and what investigators would find scattered across the frozen wilderness would prove even more disturbing than the abandoned tent on the mountainside. Following the trail of footprints leading away from the tent, search teams made their way down the slope toward a stand of cedar trees approximately 1 mile from the campsite. The tracks remained visible in areas protected from wind, providing a clear path that investigators could follow. What they discovered at the tree line would add new layers to an already incomprehensible mystery. On February the 27th, 1959, searchers found the first bodies at the base of a large cedar tree. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko lay dead in the snow, wearing only their underwear. Investigation records document that both men had severe frostbite on their hands and feet, consistent with prolonged exposure to extreme cold. Most puzzling was evidence that they had attempted to climb the cedar tree. Broken branches and bark injuries on their hands indicated desperate efforts to reach the upper limbs. Forensic examination revealed that both men had died of hypothermia, but not before engaging in seemingly irrational behavior. The cedar tree showed signs of branches being broken off at heights up to 15 feet above ground. Investigators found no evidence of tools that might have been used to cut these branches, suggesting the men had climbed the tree and broken them by hand in sub-zero conditions. Pieces of charred wood and clothing found near the base of the tree indicated attempts to start a fire. The condition of the bodies provided the first concrete timeline for the tragedy. Medical examiners estimated that Doroshenko and Krivonishenko had died within 2 to 6 hours of leaving the tent, consistent with the lethal effects of exposure in -30-degree temperatures. However, their location at the tree line and evidence of their activities suggested they had remained functional far longer than medical science would predict for inadequately clothed individuals in such conditions. Search teams expanded their efforts in the immediate area, knowing that the remaining 7 group members could not have traveled far in their minimal clothing. On March 5th, investigators found the body of Igor Dyatlov himself, approximately 300 meters back up the slope from the cedar tree, positioned as if he had been attempting to return to the tent. Medical examination showed he had died of hypothermia, with no signs of external violence or trauma. 2 days later, searchers discovered the bodies of Zinaida Kolmogorova and Rustam Slobodin at different points along what appeared to be a path between the cedar tree and the tent. Like Dyatlov, both appeared to have been attempting to return to their shelter when they succumbed to the cold. Forensic analysis revealed that Slobodin had suffered a skull fracture, though medical examiners could not determine whether this injury occurred before or after death, or whether it contributed to his demise. The pattern of body locations told a chilling story of the group's final hours. Evidence suggested that, after abandoning their tent, the 9 hikers had made their way to the relative shelter of the forest. The 2 Yuris had remained at the cedar tree, apparently attempting to build a fire and signal for help by climbing the tree. The other 7 had initially stayed with them but eventually decided to attempt a return to the tent for supplies and better shelter. None of them succeeded in their desperate plan. Investigation records show that the return journey of approximately 1 mile proved fatal for each person who attempted it. The combination of inadequate clothing, extreme cold, and physical exhaustion from their initial flight from the tent had left them too weakened to cover the distance back to safety. However, the discovery of 5 bodies still left 4 group members unaccounted for. Despite intensive searching of the surrounding area, no trace could be found of Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles, or Semyon Zolotaryov. Their absence added yet another layer of mystery to an already inexplicable case. Weather conditions and the approaching spring thaw forced authorities to suspend the active search operation in March 1959. The bodies of the 5 located victims were transported to Sverdlovsk for detailed autopsy examination, while the search for the remaining 4 was postponed until conditions improved. The official case file remained open, but hopes of finding additional survivors had long since faded. The autopsies of the first 5 victims provided crucial medical evidence but failed to answer the fundamental questions surrounding their deaths. All had died of hypothermia in conditions consistent with prolonged exposure to extreme cold. None showed evidence of violence from other humans or animals. Most puzzling of all, toxicology tests revealed no traces of alcohol, drugs, or other substances that might explain their seemingly irrational decision to abandon their tent. The medical examiner's reports, preserved in Soviet archives, documented one particularly disturbing detail. Despite dying of hypothermia, several victims showed evidence of significant physical activity in their final hours. Broken fingernails, abrasions on hands and feet, and muscle strain patterns suggested they had engaged in strenuous efforts, climbing trees, attempting to build fires, and making the desperate journey back toward their tent. This evidence painted a picture of rational, determined individuals fighting for survival rather than people in a state of panic or mental incapacitation. Their actions, seeking shelter in the forest, attempting to create fire and signals, and trying to return for supplies, represented logical survival responses. The mystery lay not in their behavior after leaving the tent, but in what had driven them from their shelter in the first place. As spring arrived in the northern Urals, investigators knew they faced an unprecedented challenge. 5 people were dead from exposure after abandoning their shelter in deadly conditions. 4 others remained missing, and no rational explanation existed for the initial incident that had triggered the entire tragedy. The search would resume, but the mystery was only beginning to deepen. Spring snowmelt in the northern Urals typically begins in early May, revealing landscapes hidden under months of accumulated snow. As temperatures rose in 1959, authorities prepared to resume their search for the 4 missing members of the Dyatlov expedition. The discovery they would make would transform an already mysterious case into something that challenged the boundaries of forensic science. On May 4, 1959, searchers using long metal probes detected anomalies beneath the snow in a ravine, approximately 75 meters from the cedar tree where the first 2 bodies had been found. Investigation records document that the probe encountered what felt like clothing and human remains buried under approximately 4 meters of packed snow. The location was in a natural drainage area where spring runoff had created a small stream beneath the snow cover. The excavation process required extreme care to preserve potential evidence and maintain the integrity of the remains. Soviet investigators brought in specialized equipment and forensic experts from Sverdlovsk to supervise the recovery operation. What they found would add new and disturbing elements to an already incomprehensible mystery. The 4 missing hikers, Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles, and Semyon Zolotaryov, were discovered lying in running water at the bottom of the ravine. Unlike the first 5 victims found on the mountainside, these 4 were more fully dressed, wearing clothes taken from their deceased companions. Investigation records show that several items of clothing were contaminated with radioactive particles, though the source and significance of this contamination would never be adequately explained. The condition of these 4 bodies differed dramatically from the first 5 victims and would generate controversy that continues to this day. While Dyatlov, mountainside victims had died of hypothermia, with no signs of external trauma. The ravine victims had suffered severe injuries that forensic experts struggled to explain using conventional causes. Autopsy records, declassified decades later, document the extent of these injuries with clinical precision. Lyudmila Dubinina was missing her tongue, eyes, and part of her lips. Her chest showed massive internal injuries, including multiple rib fractures and damage to internal organs. Medical examiners estimated that the force required to cause such injuries would be equivalent to that of a high-speed automobile accident. Nikolai Thibault Brignoles had suffered a major skull fracture that medical experts determined would have been immediately fatal. The nature of the fracture suggested impact with tremendous force, far exceeding what might result from a fall or blow from a human assailant. Alexander Kolevatov and Semyon Zolotaryov had sustained severe chest injuries, including multiple fractured ribs and damage to internal organs. The forensic pathologist conducting the autopsies, Dr. Boris Vozrojdeny, documented his findings with unusual care, noting details that would fuel speculation for decades. According to his reports, the injuries showed no external wounds corresponding to the internal damage. The victim's clothing was intact with no tears or evidence of external impact. Most puzzling, the massive internal trauma appeared to have been caused by some form of pressure rather than blunt force impact. Dr. Vozrojdeny's official conclusion, preserved in the case file, stated that the injuries were caused by an unknown compelling force, terminology rarely used in forensic pathology reports. His professional opinion, based on 30 years of experience including wartime trauma cases, was that he had never encountered internal injuries of this severity without corresponding external damage. The radioactive contamination detected on the clothing added another layer of mystery. Soviet authorities conducted extensive testing but never identified the source of the contamination or explained how it had occurred. The levels detected were described as significant but not immediately lethal, though no medical evaluations were conducted to determine potential long-term health effects on the victims before their deaths. Investigation records from the ravine site revealed additional puzzling details. The 4 bodies were found in flowing water that should have prevented complete freezing, yet they showed signs of having been frozen and thawed multiple times. The positioning of the bodies suggested they had not simply fallen into the ravine, but had been there for an extended period, possibly since shortly after the initial incident in February. Most disturbing was the evidence that these 4 individuals had survived longer than the others. Analysis of their clothing and personal effects suggested they had attempted to gather supplies from their deceased companions, indicating they had remained alive and functional after the others had perished. This meant they had somehow survived in the wilderness for days or possibly weeks before sustaining their fatal injuries. The question of how 4 people could survive in the Siberian wilderness for weeks in winter conditions became central to understanding the case. These individuals had clearly demonstrated remarkable survival skills and determination, yet they had ultimately suffered injuries that defied conventional explanation. The timeline suggested their injuries occurred well after the initial incident that had driven the group from their tent. Soviet investigators faced an unprecedented forensic challenge. They had 9 victims of the same incident who had died under completely different circumstances and from different causes. The first 5 had succumbed to hypothermia in a clear sequence of events following their abandonment of the tent. The last 4 had survived for an extended period before suffering massive trauma from an unknown source. The official investigation concluded in May 1959 with a finding that the deaths were caused by an unknown compelling force, the same terminology used by the forensic pathologist. The case file was classified and sealed, not to be reopened for 30 years. The families of the victims were told their loved ones had died in an accident, but no details of the circumstances were provided. The classification of the Dyatlov past case file would fuel speculation and conspiracy theories for decades. When documents were finally declassified in the 1990s, The forensic evidence raised more questions than it answered. The mystery of what had driven 9 experienced mountaineers from their tent remained unsolved, but the discovery in the ravine had added a new and even more disturbing dimension to the case. The Soviet government's response to the Dyatlov Pass incident reflected the complex political and military realities of 1959. As investigation reports reached higher levels of authority, the case began attracting attention from organizations far removed from local search and rescue operations. The transition from a tragic hiking accident to a classified state matter occurred gradually but inexorably as evidence accumulated that defied conventional explanation. Military records declassified in the post-Soviet era revealed that by March 1959, several government agencies had taken interest in the case. The Committee for State Security, known as the KGB, assigned agents to monitor the investigation and report on findings. The Ministry of Defense received briefings on the incident, particularly regarding the radioactive contamination found on victims' clothing. Regional party officials in Sverdlovsk Oblast faced pressure to control information flow and prevent panic among the local population. The decision to classify the case file came in late May 1959, shortly after the discovery of the 4 bodies in the ravine. Official documents from the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union indicate that the classification order was issued to prevent the spread of unfounded rumors and speculation that could damage public confidence in state institutions. The order was signed by high-ranking party officials and carried the authority of national security classification. Investigation records show that the lead investigator, Senior Lieutenant Lev Ivanov, strongly objected to the classification order. Ivanov's reports, discovered decades later in declassified archives, reveal his frustration with political interference in what he considered a straightforward criminal investigation. His final report, submitted before the case was sealed, concluded that the victims had died from an unknown compelling force, but recommended continued investigation to identify the specific cause. The classification process involved multiple steps designed to control information and limit access to case materials. All physical evidence was transferred to secure storage facilities in Moscow. Forensic reports were reclassified and access restricted to personnel with appropriate security clearances. Local officials involved in the search and investigation were required to sign non-disclosure agreements, preventing them from discussing details of the case. Perhaps most controversially, the families of the victims were provided with minimal information about the circumstances of their loved ones' deaths. Official death certificates listed hypothermia as the cause of death for all 9 victims, with no mention of the suspicious circumstances, unexplained injuries, or radioactive contamination. Funeral services were held under close government supervision, with authorities controlling attendance and preventing public discussion of the case details. The geographic isolation of the incident site also came under new restrictions. Military documents reveal that the area around Kholat Shachel was declared off-limits to civilian access for a period of 3 years following the incident. Official justification for this closure cited safety concerns related to dangerous terrain and weather conditions, but the timing and duration of the restriction fueled speculation about hidden evidence or ongoing investigations. Soviet media coverage of the incident was strictly controlled from the beginning. Initial reports in local newspapers described a hiking accident in the northern Urals, with minimal details about casualties or circumstances. As the investigation progressed and unusual evidence emerged, media coverage was gradually reduced and eventually eliminated entirely. By summer 1959, no official mention of the Dyatlov incident could be found in Soviet publications. The classification also extended to academic and scientific communities that might normally be consulted on unusual forensic cases. University researchers who had expertise in cold weather physiology, trauma, medicine, or radioactive contamination were not permitted to review the evidence or contribute to the investigation. This limitation significantly reduced the scientific resources available to understand the unusual aspects of the case. International attention to the Dyatlov incident was virtually non-existent during the Soviet era. largely due to the closed nature of Soviet society and the geographic remoteness of the incident location. The few foreign correspondents working in the Soviet Union in 1959 had no access to information about the case, and government censors ensured that no details reached international media outlets. The personal cost of classification fell heavily on the victims' families and friends. Parents and siblings were left with unanswered questions about their loved ones' final hours and the circumstances that led to their deaths. University classmates and hiking companions found themselves unable to discuss the tragedy openly or seek closure through community mourning. The silence imposed by classification created a lasting trauma that affected the Sverdlovsk mountaineering community for decades. Declassified documents from the 1990s reveal that several government agencies maintained active interest in the Dyatlov case long after the initial classification. KGB files show periodic reviews of the case, materials and assessments of whether continued secrecy was necessary. Military intelligence reports indicate that foreign governments, particularly those of NATO countries, occasionally inquired about rumors of unusual incidents in the Soviet Arctic regions. The 3-decade classification period reflected standard Soviet practice for cases involving potential state security implications. However, the specific reasons for considering the Dyatlov incident a security matter were never clearly articulated in declassified documents. References to protection of state interests and prevention of speculation harmful to public order provide little insight into the government's actual concerns about the case. When the case file was finally declassified in 1990, during the glasnost period under Mikhail Gorbachev, many of the original investigators had died, and physical evidence had been lost or destroyed. The release of information came too late to allow for meaningful reinvestigation of the incident. However, the declassified materials provided the first official confirmation of many details that had circulated as rumors and speculation for 3 decades. The government's handling of the Dyatlov Pass incident became a case study in Soviet information control and the prioritization of state security over public transparency. The classification decision, while consistent with Soviet practices of the era, ensured that one of the most puzzling mysteries in mountaineering history would remain unsolved for generations. The official silence created a vacuum that was filled by speculation, conspiracy theories, and endless debate about what really happened on that February night in the Ural Mountains. Today, more than 6 decades after the incident, the Russian government maintains some restrictions on access to materials related to the case. While basic facts have been disclosed, certain forensic details and investigation reports remain classified. The continued secrecy ensures that the Dyatlov Pass incident remains one of history's most enduring and frustrating mysteries. In the decades following the declassification of the Dyatlov Pass files, investigators, scientists, and researchers have applied modern forensic techniques and theories to the evidence from 1959. Despite advances in pathology, meteorology, and investigative methods, the case continues to resist definitive explanation, generating new theories while failing to provide conclusive answers to the fundamental questions that have haunted the case for over 6 decades. Contemporary forensic analysis has focused extensively on the nature of the injuries sustained by the 4 victims found in the ravine. Modern trauma specialists who have reviewed Dr. Vozrozhdeni's autopsy reports generally confirm his assessment that the internal injuries were consistent with extreme pressure rather than blunt force impact. However, they have struggled to identify any natural or human-caused phenomenon that could produce such specific trauma patterns without corresponding external damage. Aviation medical experts have noted similarities between the ravine victims' injuries and those seen in high-altitude aircraft accidents, where rapid decompression or extreme G-forces can cause massive internal trauma without external wounds. However, no plausible mechanism exists for such forces to occur naturally in a mountain wilderness setting. The comparison has led some researchers to speculate about unknown atmospheric phenomena or secret military testing, though no evidence supports these theories. Recent meteorological studies have examined weather conditions in the northern Urals during February 1959, searching for natural phenomena that might explain the group's behavior. Research published in the Journal of Mountain Science in 2019 analyzed historical weather data and concluded that the region experienced typical winter conditions with no unusual atmospheric disturbances during the relevant time period. However, some meteorologists have proposed that localized phenomena such as katabatic winds or temperature inversions might have created conditions that the hikers perceived as threatening. One of the most extensively studied theories involves infrasound, low-frequency sound waves that can cause psychological distress and panic in humans. Research conducted by acoustic specialists suggests that specific wind conditions interacting with the mountain terrain could potentially generate infrasound, frequencies known to induce anxiety, disorientation, and irrational behavior. Laboratory studies have demonstrated that exposure to certain infrasound frequencies can cause feelings of unease and the sensation of being watched, potentially explaining why experienced mountaineers might abandon their shelter. However, critics of the infrasound theory point out that the Dyatlov group's behavior after leaving the tent was rational and organized, inconsistent with the disorientation typically associated with infrasound exposure. Their coordinated movement to the forest, attempts to build fires, and systematic efforts to return to their tent suggest clear thinking rather than panic-induced confusion. Modern radiation specialists have also examined the evidence of radioactive contamination found on the ravine victims' clothing. Analysis of the declassified test results indicates that the contamination was primarily from cesium-137 and strontium-90, isotopes consistent with nuclear weapons testing. The Soviet Union conducted extensive nuclear testing during the 1950s, and atmospheric fallout from these tests could theoretically have contaminated clothing or equipment. However, the concentration of radioactive particles found on specific items of clothing, rather than general environmental contamination, suggests a more direct source of exposure. Some researchers have speculated about secret nuclear accidents or military testing in the region, though declassified Soviet military records show no such activities in the northern Urals during early 1959. In 2019, Russian authorities announced a new official investigation into the Dyatlov Pass incident, citing advances in forensic science and public interest in resolving the case. The investigation, led by the Russian General Prosecutor's Office, applied modern analytical techniques to existing evidence and conducted new examinations of the incident site. Their findings, published in 2020, concluded that the deaths were caused by an avalanche that struck the tent site, forcing the hikers to evacuate quickly and ultimately leading to their deaths from exposure and trauma. However, the avalanche theory has been widely criticized by mountaineering experts and researchers familiar with the case. The tent site's location on a gentle slope with insufficient snow accumulation makes avalanche formation highly unlikely. Additionally, the tent's condition and the organized nature of the hikers' departure from the campsite are inconsistent with sudden burial by an avalanche. Most significantly, the severe internal injuries sustained by the ravine victims cannot be explained by avalanche trauma patterns documented in medical literature. DNA analysis conducted on preserved tissue samples from the victims has confirmed their identities but provided no new insights into the cause of their deaths or the circumstances surrounding the incident. Advanced toxicology testing using modern techniques has similarly failed to identify any substances that might explain their behavior or medical conditions that could have contributed to the tragedy. Psychological profiling of the Dyatlov group members conducted using modern behavioral analysis techniques has revealed that all 9 individuals were experienced outdoors enthusiasts with strong survival instincts and proven ability to handle emergency situations. Their collective decision-making patterns, based on previous expedition reports and testimonies from friends and colleagues, suggest they were rational, safety-conscious individuals unlikely to take unnecessary risks or panic under pressure. The persistence of the Dyatlov Pass mystery in the internet age has spawned countless online communities dedicated to analyzing evidence, proposing theories, and debating possible explanations. Websites, forums, and social media groups attract thousands of participants who meticulously examine photographs, study maps, and develop increasingly elaborate theories to explain the incident. This crowdsourced investigation has generated creative hypotheses, but has not produced any breakthrough insights that satisfy forensic standards of evidence. Documentary filmmakers and investigative journalists continue to visit the incident site, conducting their own examinations and interviews with surviving witnesses and family members. While these efforts have preserved important testimony and generated public interest in the case, they have also contributed to the proliferation of unsupported theories and speculation that often overshadows factual evidence. Scientific expeditions to the Dyatlov Pass site have been conducted by researchers from multiple countries using modern equipment to map the terrain, analyze soil samples, and measure atmospheric conditions. These studies have confirmed many details of the original investigation while failing to identify any unusual environmental factors that might explain in the incident. The remote location and harsh climate continue to make detailed forensic investigation challenging, even with modern technology. The case has also attracted attention from experts in anomalous phenomena and unexplained events. While mainstream science has found no evidence of paranormal or extraterrestrial involvement, the inability to identify a conventional explanation has left room for speculation about unknown natural phenomena or undiscovered aspects of human physiology and psychology. Recent advances in cold weather medicine have provided new insights into hypothermia and its effects on human behavior, but these studies have generally supported rather than contradicted the original forensic conclusions about the 5 victims found on the mountainside. The medical aspects of the case remain consistent with current understanding of cold weather survival and the physiological effects of extreme exposure. As we approach the 65th anniversary of the incident, the Dyatlov Pass mystery remains as compelling and frustrating as ever. Despite decades of investigation, advanced forensic techniques, and countless theories, the fundamental questions persist. What drove 9 experienced mountaineers from their shelter into certain death in the Siberian wilderness? What caused the severe internal injuries found on 4 of the victims? Why was the case classified by Soviet authorities for 30 years? The answers to these questions may never be found. The passage of time has degraded physical evidence, witnesses have died, and the remote location continues to guard its secrets. Yet the search for truth continues, driven by the human need to understand the inexplicable and honor the memory of 9 young people who ventured into the wilderness and encountered something that cost them their lives. The Dyatlov Pass incident stands as a reminder that even in our age of scientific advancement and technological sophistication, some mysteries remain beyond our ability to solve. It challenges our assumptions about what we know and understand about the natural world and human behavior under extreme stress. Most importantly, it preserves the memory of 9 individuals whose final hours remain shrouded in mystery, but whose courage and determination in their final struggle for survival deserves to be remembered and honored. Whether the truth about the Dyatlov Pass incident will ever be fully revealed remains an open question. What is certain is that the case will continue to fascinate and frustrate investigators, researchers, and curious minds for generations to come. In a world where information is increasingly available and mysteries are rapidly solved, the Dyatlov Pass stands as one of the last great unsolved enigmas of the modern era. What do you think really happened on that February night in 1959? The evidence is there for anyone to examine, but after 6 decades the mountain keeps its secrets. Let us know your theories in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to Declassified for more investigations into history's most baffling mysteries. Some questions may never have answers, but that doesn't mean we should stop asking them. The 9 members of the Dyatlov expedition went into the wilderness seeking adventure and challenge. What they found instead was something that has puzzled the world for over 60 years. Their story serves as both a tragic reminder of nature's power and an enduring mystery that continues to defy explanation. In the end, perhaps that is their most fitting memorial, a mystery as enduring and challenging as the mountains they loved to explore.